There's a folder on the table in front of me. Plain manila, nothing special about it to look at. My hand is resting on top of it, flat, still. Across the table, my sister Priya is mid-sentence, using that warm, reasonable voice she's used on our parents since she was old enough to talk. I just think for everyone's peace of mind, she's saying, maybe it makes sense for Maya to step back from managing the accounts for a while. Just until things feel clearer. Our mother is nodding slowly, the way she nods when she doesn't know what else to do with her hands or her face. She's told me, more than once in the past 2 weeks, that she doesn't know who to believe anymore. I understand in a distant, aching way why that sentence hurt as much as it did. Because for 36 years, believing me had never been a question she needed to ask herself. I haven't opened the folder yet. I want you to sit with that detail for a second because I certainly have, many times since. I'd spent 2 years making absolutely sure that every single dollar that moved through my parents' accounts could be traced, documented, explained. I did it out of habit, honestly, more than suspicion. The same way I reconcile every ledger for every small business client I've ever had, down to the last cent. I never imagined the first person I'd ever have to actually use that habit against would be my own sister. And I definitely never imagined that the proof sitting inside that folder would trace back to a phone number I had picked out myself, 2 years earlier, for a reason that had nothing to do with any of this. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up, not far, just a few weeks, to a birthday party with balloons and a bounce house, and a woman I trusted more than almost anyone else in the world pulling me aside to ask me a question that changed everything. My name is Maya. I'm 36 and I've spent most of my adult life doing bookkeeping. First for small businesses around town, eventually building enough of a reputation that people started asking me to help with more personal things too. Untangling messy accounts. Making sense of numbers that didn't add up. It's quiet work. Nobody throws a parade for a well-reconciled ledger. But I've always found something deeply satisfying in it. The sense that if you look closely enough, carefully enough, the truth is always sitting right there in the numbers, waiting for someone patient enough to find it. 2 years ago, my father was diagnosed with early dementia. Nothing dramatic at first, misplaced keys, a forgotten appointment, the kind of thing you chalk up to age until the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Bills started slipping through the cracks. A late payment here, a missed transfer there. So I stepped in quietly, the way I do most things, and started managing my parents' finances alongside my own bookkeeping clients. I'm married to a patient, steady man named David, and we have a daughter, Zoe, who was about to turn 7. Our life, most days, was ordinary in the best possible way. School mornings, homework at the kitchen table, the particular chaos of raising a kid while also running a business from a spare bedroom. My younger sister, Priya, has always been the fun one. I don't say that with resentment, exactly, or I didn't used to anyway. She's effortlessly likable, the kind of person who lights up a room the second she walks into it. Our parents adored her openly, visibly, in a way that never quite extended to me the same way. I was the responsible one, the one you didn't have to worry about. And somewhere along the way, without ever fully admitting it to myself, I think I decided that being useful was the closest I was going to get to being adored the way she was. I never said that out loud to anyone. Not to David, not to a therapist, not even really to myself until much later. I just quietly overcorrected. Always available, always generous, always the one managing the accounts, hosting the holidays, handling the hard things. I told myself it didn't bother me. I didn't know yet how expensive that particular lie was about to become. Let me tell you what an ordinary month looked like, before any of this started. I'd spend my mornings at my desk, going through client ledgers, answering emails, the kind of steady, unglamorous work that made me feel competent in a way few other things did. In the afternoons, I'd pick Zoe up from school, and most evenings after homework and dinner, I'd log into my parents' bank account for 10 or 15 minutes, just to check that everything was reconciled. A habit so automatic by then I barely registered doing it. Priya would call our mother most days, usually in the afternoon, usually about something light. A funny story from her boutique, a new dress she was excited about. Her business had been struggling for a while, though I only understood the full extent of that much later. At the time, I just knew she talked about it vaguely, the way people do when they don't want to worry anyone, and our parents always seemed a little relieved whenever she called, a little brighter. I didn't resent that brightness, not exactly. I told myself it was just how things had always been. Priya brought the warmth, I brought the reliability, and somehow that division of labor had always felt, on the surface, fair enough. Zoe's 7th birthday was coming up, and I threw myself into planning it the way I threw myself into everything. Carefully, thoroughly, a little too much, if I'm honest. A bounce house. A specific bakery 2 towns over that made the exact kind of funfetti cake Zoe had been dreaming about for months. I spent weeks on the guest list, the decorations, the timing. I remember once, during that stretch of planning, glancing at my parents' account balance and noticing it seemed slightly lower than I'd expected. I didn't think much of it. Life had been busy, doctor's appointments for my father, birthday planning, a client emergency that had eaten an entire week. I told myself I'd look closer when things settled down. I didn't know, that week, that I was looking directly at the beginning of something I wouldn't understand for months. Zoe's birthday party was, by every visible measure, perfect. The bounce house was a hit. The funfetti cake got exactly the reaction I'd hoped for. Zoe ran around the backyard with her friends, flushed and delighted, and for most of that afternoon, I let myself just be a mother watching her daughter be happy. Nothing more complicated than that. Then my mother pulled me aside near the drink table, her face arranged into an expression I'd never quite seen on her before. Worried, careful, like she was approaching something fragile. "Maya," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was close enough to hear. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Okay," I said, my stomach already tightening, though I couldn't have told you why yet. "There's money missing from your father's account. Almost $6,000 over the last few months." She paused, and I watched her search for the gentlest possible way to say the next part. "Have you been dipping into it? Even just to help with things, I wouldn't be angry, I just need to know." I stood there, a paper plate of cake going soft and warm in my hand, and felt the ground tilt slightly under a conversation I hadn't seen coming at all. "No," I said, too fast, too stunned to modulate it. "Mom, no, I haven't touched anything I wasn't supposed to. I can pull every statement right now if you want." She nodded, but something in her face didn't fully relax, and I understood in that moment that this wasn't really a question she'd come to ask lightly. Someone had planted a seed carefully enough that even my own mother, who had never once doubted me about anything, was standing in my backyard at my daughter's birthday party, wondering if I'd been stealing from my own father. I didn't know yet who had planted that seed. I had a guess. I didn't want to look at it directly yet. I offered, immediately, to pull every bank statement, every transaction, anything my mother needed to see. I was so certain in that moment that this would resolve within a day, a misunderstanding, a bank error, something explainable. "Of course," my mother said, relieved, patting my arm. "I just had to ask." I turned, still holding my plate of half-eaten cake, and caught sight of Priya standing a little way off, near the fence, watching the exchange. She wasn't close enough to have heard the specifics, but close enough to have clearly understood the shape of the conversation. Her expression, when our eyes met, softened into something I read, in that moment, as sympathy, a little sad smile, a small shake of her head like she felt for me. "I want to be honest with you. It didn't occur to me, not even slightly, to read that expression any other way. Priya had never given me a reason to." The party wound down. I hugged relatives goodbye, thanked the bakery delivery driver, helped Zoe carry her gifts inside, all while some quiet, unsettled hum sat underneath everything, refusing to fully go away. Over the following days it got worse, though not all at once. It came in fragments secondhand, the way bad news often does in families. My mother mentioning to my aunt that Maya's always been so private about the account. A comment I only heard about because my aunt, uncomfortable, repeated it to me almost apologetically. A cousin texting, half joking, asking if it was true I had full control of my parents' money. I felt something shifting underneath me that I couldn't fully name yet. a narrative taking shape quietly that reframed years of careful, unpaid, unthanked competence into something that sounded, suddenly, a lot like opportunity. I didn't sleep well that week. I lay awake next to David, running through every account I'd managed for my parents, every transaction I could remember approving or declining, trying to find some thread that would explain $6,000 disappearing without my noticing. "You know you didn't do anything," David said one of those nights, his hand finding mine in the dark. "This will get sorted out." "I know," I said. And I did know logically. But knowing didn't stop the specific, cold loneliness of realizing people who had never doubted me before suddenly weren't sure. At a smaller family gathering that weekend, nothing formal, just my parents, my aunt, and Priya, gathered for what was supposed to be a quiet Sunday dinner, the subject came up again gently, the way these things always seem to come up now. My aunt mentioned carefully that she'd heard I'd been handling everything so closely with the accounts, in a tone that made the compliment sound, somehow, like an accusation. I sat there, at a table I'd sat at 100 times before, feeling the specific vertigo of watching your own competence get quietly repainted as suspicious. I didn't explode. I didn't demand to know who had started the whisper campaign, even though the question sat, sharp and insistent, at the back of my throat the entire meal. I looked once at Priya, hoping, foolishly, I understand now, that she might say something, defend me even mildly. She just looked down at her plate, quiet in a way I read at the time as discomfort on my behalf. I didn't yet understand that her silence wasn't discomfort at all. It was relief that someone else was doing the work of suspicion for her. By the following week, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Not the missing money. I still believed fundamentally that I could explain that, given time, but the shape of what was happening around me, the way the story of the last 2 years was quietly being rewritten by people who hadn't been in the room for any of it. I sat down, finally, with my laptop and pulled the actual statements myself, determined to find whatever explanation would put this to rest. And what I found instead made my stomach drop in a completely different way. The withdrawals were small, spaced out over months, never large enough on their own to trigger obvious alarm. And when I checked the dates against my own calendar, against my own memory, I realized with a sick, sinking clarity that nearly every single withdrawal had happened during a week I hadn't been checking the account closely. The week I was buried in birthday planning, the week of my father's cardiology appointment, the week David's mother had a health scare and everything else fell away. The weeks I hadn't been watching weren't just weeks I could explain. They were, I realized, exactly the weeks that made me look guilty. My own alibi, busy, distracted, focused elsewhere, read on paper like opportunity. I sat at my desk long after the numbers stopped making sense through the blur in my eyes. I didn't cry easily, not normally, but I let myself that night, alone in my studio, the door closed so Zoe wouldn't hear. I remember thinking, clearly, for the first time, I might actually lose this. Not just the accounts. The truth of who I've actually been to this family for years, without anyone ever really noticing. I didn't know that night that a phone number I'd chosen 2 years earlier for an entirely unrelated reason was about to become the only thing standing between me and that loss. It came back to me almost by accident, a few days later, while I was on the phone with my bank's fraud department about something completely unrelated to my parents' account. One of my own bookkeeping clients had flagged a suspicious charge, and I'd called to walk through the verification process with them. The representative mentioned, casually, that any card-present withdrawal over a certain amount would trigger a text alert to the account's linked verification number. And something in the back of my mind, half buried under weeks of stress, snagged on that detail. I remembered suddenly clearly, 2 years ago, when I first took over my parents' accounts, I'd insisted on setting up exactly that kind of 2-factor verification, out of the same meticulous habit that shaped everything I did professionally. I'd used my father's old flip phone number for the linked alert, a number I'd assumed at the time was long retired, sitting unused in some drawer. I sat very still at my desk, the client call forgotten for a moment, turning that memory over. If the verification system was still active, and there was no reason it wouldn't be, since I'd never changed it, then every single one of those unauthorized withdrawals should have triggered a text alert to that old number. Which meant somewhere there was a record, not of who physically made the withdrawal, but of exactly where every fraud alert for it had been delivered. I didn't know yet what I'd find. I only knew, for the first time in weeks, that I had somewhere real to look. I called the carrier the next morning, my hands steadier than I expected them to be, and asked, as calmly as I could manage, for the delivery records tied to that old number, going back as far as they could pull them. It took 2 days and a maddening amount of hold music before someone finally emailed me a report. I sat down at my kitchen table that evening, after Zoe was in bed, and opened it slowly, half afraid of what I might find and half afraid of finding nothing at all. The line was still active. That much I confirmed almost immediately. What stopped me cold was the second thing I found, a note buried in the account history, showing the physical SIM card associated with that number had been swapped 8 months earlier. Not canceled. Transferred. I sat with that for a long moment, my mind moving slowly toward a conclusion I didn't want to reach yet. I thought back, then, to a conversation with my father a few months earlier. Something small, easy to miss at the time. He'd mentioned, almost in passing, that Priya's phone had broken and that he'd sorted her out with an old line he had lying around, just so he could reach her. I remembered laughing it off gently, telling him that was sweet of him, not thinking about it again for even a second. I sat very still in my kitchen, the carrier report glowing on my laptop screen, feeling something in my chest go quiet and cold and absolutely certain. Every fraud alert for every unauthorized withdrawal from my parents' account, for the past 8 months, had been landing silently on my sister's phone. I didn't call anyone that night. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, the laptop glowing in front of me, feeling the shape of the last 2 months rearrange itself completely. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a bank error, a scam, a coincidence. It was Priya, my sister, the one who'd stood at the edge of my daughter's birthday party with a sympathetic expression while our mother quietly wondered if I was a thief. The one who'd let secondhand comments about my privacy, with the accounts spread through the family without ever once correcting them. The one who, at a dinner meant to clear the air, had gently suggested I step back from the very role that would eventually let me find this. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't rage, not at first. It was something quieter and heavier. A kind of grief for a version of my sister I'd apparently never fully known, sitting right alongside the cold, clear understanding of exactly what she'd done. I thought about calling her directly, confronting her privately, giving her a chance to explain, to apologize, to fix this quietly before it became something the whole family had to sit with. But I thought, too, about the family dinner already being planned, the one where Priya intended to suggest, gently, reasonably, in front of our parents, that I be removed from managing the accounts altogether. If I confronted her privately now, I understood, she'd have time to build a new story before that dinner ever happened. I'd lose the one moment where the truth could actually land clearly, undeniably, in front of the people who needed to hear it. I decided, sitting there in my kitchen, that I wasn't going to let that happen. Not out of anger. Out of the same careful, methodical instinct that had gotten me this far in the first place. I closed the laptop, saved everything twice, and started quietly to prepare. Over the next few days, I did what I know how to do best. I built a case the way I'd build a reconciliation report for a client, methodically, without emotion clouding the details. I printed the carrier's delivery records, highlighting the SIM transfer date, and every fraud alert timestamp that followed. I cross-referenced each alert against the exact withdrawal dates from the bank statements, lining them up side by side, so the pattern would be immediately, undeniably clear to anyone looking at it. I didn't tell my mother yet. I didn't tell David the full plan, though he knew something had shifted, watching me work quietly at the kitchen table late into the evening, printer humming in the next room. The family dinner to clear the air was scheduled for that Sunday. I knew, without needing to be told directly, what Priya intended to do there. I'd heard enough second-hand murmurs by then to understand she planned to suggest, gently in front of our parents, that I stepped back from managing the accounts, framing it as protecting everyone from more confusion. I let her plan it. I didn't warn her. I didn't warn anyone, actually, beyond quietly asking my mother if I could bring some paperwork to the dinner, just in case it's useful, in a tone that gave nothing away. The night before, I sat with the folder closed in front of me on the kitchen table, running through, one more time, exactly how I wanted to lay it out, not as an accusation, not as a performance, but the way I'd walk any client through a discrepancy. One column at a time. Let the numbers do what numbers do. I went to bed that night feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Steady. The dinner started the way these things always start now. Careful, a little too polite, everyone choosing their words with visible effort. My mother had made too much food, the way she does when she's anxious. My father, gentle and a little confused by the tension he could sense but not fully place, asked twice if everything was all right. Priya waited until dessert, the way she always did, to bring things to a head. She set down her fork, looked around the table with practiced gentleness, and said, "I've been thinking, and I really don't say this to hurt anyone, but maybe for everyone's peace of mind, it makes sense for Maya to step back from managing the accounts for a while. Just until things feel clearer." A few heads nodded slowly, uncertainly. My mother's eyes flicked toward me, apologetic, torn. I set the folder down on the table. "Before we decide anything," I said, my voice even quiet, "I think everyone should see this." I opened it and laid out the pages one at a time, the way I would for any client. The bank statements, the withdrawal dates circled in red. Beside them, the carrier report, the SIM transfer, dated 8 months earlier. And beside that, the fraud alert timestamps, one after another, each one lining up, exactly, with an unauthorized withdrawal. "This is the verification number I set up 2 years ago," I said, "when I first took over the accounts. Every large withdrawal sends an alert to it. I always assumed it was inactive." I looked up, not at Priya yet, but at my father. "Dad, do you remember giving your old number to someone about 8 months ago?" My father's face shifted, slow recognition dawning. "I gave it to Priya," he said. "Her phone broke. I didn't think anything of it." The table went very still. Priya's face had gone pale, her composure cracking in real time. I don't know what you're implying. That doesn't mean." "It means every alert for every one of these withdrawals went to your phone," I said, still quiet, still even. "Not mine. Yours. For 8 months. She tried once more weakly to redirect. "I don't know what you want me to say." "I don't need you to say anything right now," I said. "I just needed everyone at this table to see it clearly. That's all this was ever about for me." Priya left shortly after, quietly, without the dramatic exit I might have expected from her at any other point in my life. No slammed door, no final speech. Just a quiet retreat that said, somehow, more than an argument could have. My mother sat very still for a long time after she'd gone. Eventually, she reached over and put her hand over mine on the table. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "I should never have doubted you. I don't know why I did." I told her honestly that I understood why, that Priya had always been easier to believe without question, and that habit doesn't undo itself overnight, even when it should. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was something closer to relief, at finally being seen clearly, without having to argue for it. In the days that followed, my father, in one of his clearer moments, insisted on repaying the missing amount himself, out of some old savings account he still remembered how to access, waving off my attempts to say it wasn't necessary. I let him, because I understood it mattered to him to do something, however small, to correct what had happened. I didn't press charges. I never seriously considered it. This wasn't a story that needed a courtroom to feel resolved. It needed simply for the truth to be seen by the people who mattered. I want to be honest that it wasn't a clean, dramatic transformation. Priya and I haven't spoken much since that dinner. I don't know yet whether that silence is permanent or just a season we're sitting in until something shifts. I've stopped needing an immediate answer to that. What I remember most from those weeks isn't the confrontation itself. It's a smaller moment weeks later at Zoe's quieter, rescheduled birthday celebration. my mother pulling me aside, this time not with suspicion, but simply to say she should have trusted me from the start. Driving home that night, after that second, quieter birthday party, I found myself thinking about all the years before this. All the ways I'd tried, without ever quite admitting it to myself, to earn a kind of love I already had, just not in the visible, effortless way Priya had always received it. I used to think being useful was the closest I'd ever get to being adored the way she was. I don't think that anymore. What I learned through all of this wasn't that I needed to fight harder for my parents' approval, or prove myself more thoroughly than I already had for 2 quiet, unthanked years. It was that being the reliable one should never mean being the first person suspected, and that the proof I gathered mattered less, in the end, for what it showed my family, and more for what it finally let me stop carrying alone. I didn't win that dinner table by raising my voice, or by needing Priya to fully confess, or by demanding an apology large enough to erase what had happened. I won it by trusting the same quiet, careful habit that had shaped my whole life. The belief that if you look closely enough, the truth is always there, waiting for someone patient enough to find it. I don't need my parents to love me more than they love my sister. I never actually needed that, though it took me 36 years to understand it. I just needed them, finally, to see me clearly. That, it turns out, was enough.